This training video is for the split and clean procedures of the Nordson Extrusion Die's UltraFlex die. The tools you will need for this procedure are as follows. You need copper gauze, die soap or a other cleaning agent, brass scrapers to scrape the heavy polymer out of the die, a jar of anti-seize to reapply to the bolts when we put the die together. Also, with your die came a toolbox. In this toolbox, you would have a set of jack bolts to aid in the splitting of the die, a set of Allen wrenches to take out the die bolts. Some dies will need a body seal. This particular die that we'll be doing today will not need a body seal, but I would like to show you. End seal gaskets. Every time the die is split, you will need to replace the end seal gaskets. This die will be hot, so we need a good set of hot, heat-resistant gloves and a pad of an abrasive pad to clean the exterior of your die. All of these items can be purchased through your Nordson Extrusion Dies Industries spare parts department. Also, you may need various different spare parts for your die, whether it be autoflex adjustments or manual adjustments. Call your Nordson representative and he can get you a spare parts list of everything that you need to make sure you have all the parts to clean your die. Also, it's a good time to inspect your eye bolts, make sure there's no cracks, or if they're bent, you want to make sure you do not use them if they're bent. This could break when you're lifting up the die, and it could cause damage to the die or anyone standing around the die. Having a torque wrench is highly recommended for this procedure, as you will need to torque the die body seals evenly across the die. If the die body seals are not torqued evenly, you may have an issue of leaking. No power tools at all should be used on the cleaning of this die. If power tools are used, you could damage the die seal surface, you could damage the die flow surface. Anytime you do this, you run the risk of this type of damage. If you have this damage, it could impact the quality of the film or sheet that you are trying to produce. Please pay close attention when you're working around the die, not to impact the die, especially on the front edge, the counter bore, or the ends of the die. When transporting the die on a die cart, there should be a protective cover over the lip area. Also, when torquing and removing the body bolts, the protective cover should be on in place so no damage to the front edge can happen. Also, I'd like to note that Extrusion Dies Industries strongly recommends that the die body bolts be loosened while the die is on line, leaving 4 body bolts hand tight, 1 on each end and 2 in the center. This will greatly speed up the disassembly of the die, as not to let the die cool during disassembly. Once the die body bolts are loose, you can remove the electrical. Please note that you should use the correct lockout tagout procedures before doing this. We recommend that you put the die on a strong working surface, strong enough to support the weight of the die and the temperature of your specific die. And you will need an adequate lifting device to lift the die or die halves off the working surfaces. Now our technician is removing the end seal plates and seal plate assemblies from the ends of the die. As our technician removes the die body bolts, remember these are hot and the die is at working temperature. Underneath each die body bolt is a washer. Make sure that this washer gets out from underneath this die body bolt on every single one. Some dies do not have washers. Some of the older dies do not have washers. So if you do not have any, this is okay also. Place them on a surface that will not be affected by the heat of a hot bolt, and all of those have to be cleaned individually. Make sure all plastic and any debris is removed from the bolts. At this time, we have a lifting device attached to the die body, and that needs to be in a perfectly straight vertical lifting position to lift the body straight up. Next, we are taking our jack bolts and applying a generous coat of anti-seize to the threads, and then inserting them into the jack bolts holes, which are designated by the letters JB on the die body. Run those down until they are hand tightened against the dowel pin, and repeat that on all of the jack bolts. Now we remove the cardboard from the front edge, protecting the lip, and then we will be inserting shim stock in the lips that is slightly smaller than the lip opening of the die itself. If you do not have brass, you can use aluminum or a high temperature plastic. This will ensure the protection of the die lips when the die is coming apart, not to bang on each other. Now that this is in, our technician will start jacking the die apart by turning equally on both die jack bolts. As you may notice, the die lip is coming apart. You can see from the front of the die that it is spreading equally. Make sure you're keeping tension on the die lips itself by moving the chains tighter. Make sure that the die is parallel to itself here. It's not getting closer in the center and wider on the one end. We will want to make sure we have a bar in there to tip it back. Now I have a bar inserted into one of the body bolt holes to make sure that we are keeping our gap parallel all the way across the die. We want to make sure we keep tension on the die as not to let it fall forward. Okay. Once the jack bolts are screwed all the way down, then the body is ready to be removed from the lower body. Go ahead, Bill. One quick motion. At this time, we will cut the polymer. Just cut it off here. There we go. And now we'll move the die away from the lower half so that we can remove the jack bolts. We want to remove the jack bolts as soon as possible so that they do not seize up within the body. With the die half turned over, now we will start to remove the polymer by using an assortment of brass scrapers. This is also a good time if you have a trusted coworker to be working on the other half with you. Time is of the essence. We need to remove the plastic polymer as quickly as possible. Scrape the die lengthwise if possible. After we have removed the heavy polymer from our die with our brass scrapers, we will take our die soap, which is available from Nordson Extrusion Dies Industries, and apply it to the flow surfaces, the front edge lip and lip seals. This will melt as we are applying it. Put the soap only in the area that you are working on, typically about a 2-foot section. Now we are taking a piece of our copper gauze and using the brass scraper or just pushing on the copper gauze, we will scrape the die soap and clean the flow surfaces with this. You need steady pressure and speed to clean the die. But be careful not to go too fast and splatter the hot soap on yourself or your colleague working next to you. Be careful not to get the die soap into the die body holes, as this will cause the threads of the holes to be gummed up and is very difficult to be removed. You will need to change the copper gauze periodically as it will fill up with polymer, so keep your copper gauze clean and the flow surfaces will come cleaner faster. Once you are finished with your section, use more die soap and move on to the next section. Once the polymer is off the die body seals, the flow surface area, now we will take our abrasive pads and clean the seals of the die. These abrasive pads can be used on the seals and on the ends of the die, but must not be used on the flow surfaces of the die. If they are used on the flow surfaces of the die, they will cause damage to your die. Once the die is clean and the seals are clean, you want to do a die inspection. With the die inspection, you need to look over the flow surfaces, the front edge, especially looking for any nicks, dings, or any damage to the die. Check the counter bores and the ends to make sure that they are perfectly clean also. Our technician is checking the front edge to make sure there's no dings or dents on the front of this die. Next, you should remove the die lip adjusting bolts. Clean, lubricate, and reset them, and reinstall them into the die. Look to your Nordson Extrusion Dies Industries manual on how to do this. Now the die is completely cleaned, Also, we have gone through and cleaned all of the die body bolt holes, and we have gone through the die body bolt threaded holes. We have taken compressed air and blown out each individual hole to make sure there is no debris left inside the die. Now we are ready to begin our die body assembly. First, we'll take a thin coat of anti-seize and apply it to each die body pin. These die bodies are still in the hot state. Some dies will be able to go together, some dies will not. The dies that we have right now are of equal mass, so they should go together nicely. Die bodies that are of bigger mass on one side than the other may have a difficult time because of the thermal expansion going back together. These dies may have to cool off completely before they can get to put together. We will have our brass shims that are smaller than the lip opening placed inside of the die. This is to make sure that we do not bang the lips together and cause any damage. These are a nice brass shim or a aluminum or some other soft material that is high temperature. At this point, we will need two people to do this part. I will take a straight bar that we can hold the die level when it's coming into position with the die pins. Am I sticking out, Bill? Okay. We want to make sure that the die is completely parallel with the other half of the die. Now, at this point in time, we are resting on the dowel pins. The die is not going completely down, so what we will do is we will get a die bolt ready to go to put inside the die. Please note that he is putting anti-seize on the threads. Underneath on top of the washer and underneath the washer. This will be done on every single bolt. These bolts have already been properly cleaned and are ready to go. We'll go in the end here. We will start off with 2 bolts in the die first. Some of your longer dies will need more than 2 bolts to start off with. We'll go up in this. If you notice, our die is further down on one side than the other, so this is the side we will start turning down first. And the die has come together. Remove the shim. Once the die is together, we don't have any possibility of the lips hitting anymore. Once this die has been put together, we will put our lip protection on as to not ding the front edge of this die. Now that we've had 2 bolts in here and it's been tightened down by hand, we will make sure on the back side of the die in the counter bore that everything is perfectly clean and lined up perfectly. And we will check the end seals to make sure that they completely line up. Here we have all of our body bolts properly cleaned and coated with anti-seize and hand tightened into the die. So we are ready to begin the torquing procedure. Please refer to your Nordson Extrusion Dies Industries Operator's Manual for the proper torque sequence and torque specs. We will now begin torquing the die, moving from the center, crisscrossing pattern, and moving out. No, typically this would be done when the die is moved online. When the die is online, it is held steadily. So you will do this when it's up online and not here. We are doing this on the table here for demonstration purposes only. Notice when he is torquing the die that we do have the cardboard protecting the front edge on this die, so no damage can occur. Our technician is now installing the end plate onto the die with properly cleaned and anti-seize bolts. Once these bolts are in, they will be torqued down because the die bodies have already been torqued. Next, we will install the end seals and the end seal push plates. These end seals should be changed every time the die is taken apart. With the properly coated anti-seize bolt, the technician will tighten down the bolt, only hand tightened. These bolts will be torqued to the correct specification once the die has been heated up and gapped fully. Now that your Nordson extrusion dies industry die has been properly cleaned, it is ready for production once again. We would like to thank you for taking the time to view our instructional video on how to split and clean your die. If you have any questions regarding the content of this video, or you need spare parts or cleaning supplies, please contact your Nordson extrusion dies industries representative.